Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Coover. I'm an educational consultant out of the Patton Pittsburgh office, and I work on the the Transition Initiative. I'm going to be conducting today's webinar with you to talk about the 2019-2020 Competitive Integrated Employment Grants. I'm also joined today by my colleagues Hillary Mangus and Carol Good, who are going to be monitoring the chat box. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Today's webinar will be recorded, as I said earlier, and posted on the Patton website for those individuals who may not have been able to participate in today's live session. We will post the link for the webinar on the same page under secondary transition as the RFA and the grant application are located, and we'll talk about that again at the end. Also, as I said, participants will be muted throughout the session because we are recording this webinar. If you have questions during the presentation, if you could communicate them through the chat box, please do so. Carol and Hillary will be monitoring the chat box and we'll be answering those questions at the end of the webinar during our Q&A portion. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Again, if you could just indulge me while I talk about the mission of Patton. The mission of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistant Network is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education, build the capacity of local education agencies to serve students who receive special education services. Along with that, PDE's commitment to least restrictive environment. Our goal for each child is to ensure that IEP program teams begin with the general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. Okay, in terms of today's agenda, we are going to talk about five major pieces. We're going to talk about the RFA, request for application, grant priorities, the application process, deadlines, and as well as take your questions at the end of today's webinar. The RFA and application, I think we've communicated this throughout when we sent out our pen link, as well as emails that you may have received from colleagues throughout the state. The page on the Patton website, the secondary transition page, is where you can find the RFA as well as the application. We will be posting today's webinar there as well. And we hope to have that up and to everybody that was not able to participate in today's session by Friday of this week. Okay, in terms of the RFA, we're going to talk about today first the purpose of the grant, as well as the application criteria and grant priorities. Part one, the purpose of this year's competitive and integrated employment grants. We have several purposes for this. The Pennsylvania Department of Education, the Bureau of Special Education, is requesting applications for these grants for school-based competitive integrated employment programming for youth with disabilities. The ultimate goal is to provide youth with disabilities community-based paid work experiences during the 2019-2020 school year. In addition to that, the purpose of these grants is to first improve competitive integrated employment outcomes for youth with disabilities, provide work experiences including but not limited to job shadowing, internship practicums, whether they're paid or unpaid, cooperative education programs, apprenticeships, community-based work programs, and service learning, which would be unpaid, with job coaching as appropriate for youth with disabilities, with preferences for students at risk of dropping out or youth who have difficulty obtaining employment on an independent basis. We also want LEAs to establish sites that can that can serve as role models for community-based competitive employment for youth with disabilities, as well as actively involve the Office of Rehabilitation, OVR, or other county and community-based organizations, behavioral health, Office of Intellectual Disabilities, Center for Independent Learning, and other disability-specific support organizations during the development and implementation of the grant-related activities. Part two, the application criteria and grant priorities. LEAs, which include school districts, intermediate units, approved private schools, and charter schools are eligible to apply. Grant monies can be awarded to applicants that meet the following criteria. First, LEAs must have the ability to partner with local businesses. Secondly, they must collaborate with one or more of the following: Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, county or community-based behavioral health, managed care, and/or intellectual disabilities administrative entities. And finally, LEAs should be establishing or have established school-based career readiness programs within their entity. I think we mentioned this before, but the funding available for each successful grant applicant is up to $30,000, which will be available from the date of the award through August 5th of 2020. Oh, I'm sorry, August 15th of 2020. The following essential program priorities must be addressed in the grant application. First, you must identify students who will be targeted for this grant. We've had some question in terms of the grant application itself and then administering the grant. Just want to be sure that everybody understands. In terms of the grant application, you don't have to name specific students, but we do want a number of students that will be targeted. Then if you're awarded a grant, we will want specific data on specific students, so you'll have to give us the names of those students as well as data that supports their participation in the grant. Those targeted students need to be identified as youth with disabilities who have a primary post-secondary goal of competitive employment upon exiting high school, with preferences for youth who are at risk of dropping out or have difficulty obtaining independent employment. One thing that I did want to note today, again, that we've had several questions on, was the fact that we were asking for the total number of targeted students for the grant should be no less than 20% of the total number of transition age youth with disabilities. In the LEA was how we first had it worded. We did have several entities contact us that were concerned about that parameter. So what we did was we met as a staff the week before last and we discussed that parameter, and we've changed that. So just be aware that we are now looking for the total number of targeted students to be no less than 20% of the total number of transition age youth with disabilities in the building that the grant will be implemented. Building or buildings, depending on how you write that. But instead of looking at being for the total number of that population of students for the LEA, we're looking for the individual building or buildings. So please make a note of that on your RFA. Another essential program priority that we're going to be looking for in grant applications is the implementation of effective school-based career programs. Just be sure that the grantee must codify that either a school-based career development program is currently in place and is being utilized to support transition planning for youth with disabilities, or that one will be developed and utilized to support transition planning for youth with disabilities as well. I'm going to talk about a couple components of school-based career development program. We are going to be looking for person-centered planning process that is a strengths-based approach addressing self-determination, personal future planning, unconditional care, family or other natural or community supports, or systematic support and consultation. We would like one of the components to be career exploration, that being a process which a student chooses an educational path or training or job which fits their interests, skills, and abilities. We also would like to see the component of self-advocacy skill development, community mapping, which includes identification of high priority jobs with family sustaining wages, job analysis, and travel associated with community-based assessment and work experiences. Also unpaid and paid work experience with job coaching as it might be appropriate, as well as Social Security Administration benefits and work incentives planning assistance. Okay, another one of the essential priorities would be engaging family caregivers as partners in transition planning. With this, we would want the LEA engage family caregivers and participants in the transition process using a variety of activities and resources designed to provide an overview of the grant. We also would like to see folks engage relevant LEA personnel. In other words, the grantee must engage in the following school-based personnel as appropriate. We'd like to see general as well as special education teachers involved, as well as their administrators. CTE educational personnel where that's appropriate. Obviously, if you have a secondary transition coordinator, that would be a key player in the grant process, as well as school counselors in general, and again, general and special educators. We would also like as a component to see LEAs engage in community partners in transition planning. In other words, based upon the needs of the targeted students, the grantee should be engaging LEA local agency staff from those entities that I mentioned earlier, meaning the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, maybe county-based Office of Mental Health, county-based Office of Intellectual Disabilities, as well as local Center for Independent Living in the development and implementation of the grant. We're also looking for LEAs to engage businesses in transition and program implementation. Grantees must engage community businesses with the intent to support unpaid and/or paid work experiences that will lead to competitive integrated employment. One question that I have had from many folks is in terms of using the grant funds to actually pay students, and that is something that is not allowable. The paid experiences would come from the employer and not the grant process. Lastly, under terms of the criteria and grant priorities, we would require those LEA entities that get the grant would be required to collect student data. Each LEA is going to have to support each targeted youth's development of a career portfolio representing the youth's experience and evidence of data collected during that grant period. Okay, we're going to move on to part 2, part D, additional grant requirements. The term of the grant is divided up into 2 phases, phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 would be the planning for implementation phase, and phase 2 would be the actual implementation. So just a few things about those phases. Again, phase 1 would begin on the day that you were actually awarded your grant, and it would last through February 28th of 2020. Some of the things that we're looking for during that phase 1 of planning for implementation would be for the LEA to identify the names of the students. And again, as I mentioned before, on your actual application, you don't have to mention names, but during phase 1, you would be identifying those targeted students. We would also want you to conduct a community-based assessment using a county-based job market data from the Pennsylvania Department of Labor. We actually have a website that we can forward to you, and it will be in the recording in terms of how you can get that information. We'd also like you to, based on the results of that community-based assessment, identify and provide letters of support from employers who are willing to provide integrated community-based unpaid and paid work experiences for students who are supported through the grant-funded project. One thing I wanted to mention was I've had a few folks make inquiries in terms of they've already have contracts with certain entities and can they just use the contract as a letter of support. My answer to that would be no, we would need something specific from that entity based on the fact that they are aware of your grant project, and their support in meeting the goals of that project. So please just keep that in mind. Also, establishing letters of agreement with local employers to provide the work experiences for students who will be supported through the process. We also would like you to establish methods by which to monitor the performance of students. And again, if you have something in place already, you may already have this. But in terms of providing data, we would like you to be able to, again, monitor the performance of students and be able to report that back to us. Finally, we'd like to participate in supported or customized employment training based upon the targeted students. So some kind of training would need to be in place for them. All of those things I just went over are specific to phase 1. During phase 2, the actual implementation process, that will take place from February 28th, 2020 through 2020. During that implementation phase, there are two things that we would want you to do. We would want you to send students to their integrated community employment setting, as well as monitor their performance and collect that data that I mentioned earlier. Okay, part two, in terms of application criteria and grant priorities, we're going to continue with that with part E. We've had some questions in terms of technical assistance and who would be providing that. And at this point, it's really dependent on how many applications we receive and how many folks are actually funded. If it's a manageable amount, these will be monitored by folks within the patent system, in other words, patent consultants. We just want to make sure that the folks that are assigned to the initiatives are working with our LEAs first. If we have an amount of grant awardees that is a larger amount that can't be covered by patent staff, then we would look to our IU TAC to assist us with that. If I could just stop, please, folks, if you're signing in, if you could just please make sure that you're muted. We want everybody to be muted during this actual recording, and we'll take questions and answers through the chat box at the end. Okay, we're going to move to the CIEG grant application process. During this section, I'm going to talk about the title of the application program, the funding level that's requested, applicant information, program description and grant priorities, program description and additional grant requirements, as well as budget, and finally your assurance statements that need to be included with your grant application. Okay, part one is self-explanatory. You're going to want to come up with a title for your program and your grant. That'll be used in a variety of arenas, but of course we'd like you to come up with something snappy and something that's going to grab the attention of those who are scoring the grants. Part two, the funding level that's requested. Again, you can request any amount up to $30,000, but it cannot exceed that $30,000 mark. Part three, the applicant information. When you go through the actual form itself, we're going to be asking for the LEA, your address, the name of the grant coordinator. Now, folks, I've had some questions on that. Who is the grant coordinator? For our purposes, that grant coordinator is the primary contact for the grant and assumes responsibility for ensuring the implementation of the grant activities. So I know that I have a couple terms. Would the grant coordinator be your business person? No. Your grant coordinator is going to be the sole person that's going to take responsibility for the actual grant and its implementation. We're also going to ask you to name of personnel that are working with you by role, responsible for submitting to the grant or requests for reimbursements for grant-related activities, following each of the if they are different than the grant coordinator. So if the grant coordinator is working with a variety of people within the LEA, we're going to ask you to list all of those folks. The applicant type, if you're an IU, charter school, or approved private school, you're going to mark those appropriate boxes. You're also going to be asked to name the IU in which your LEA is located, as well as the county in which the project is going to be situated. Okay, in terms of disbursement, also that last slide, again, half of the award through February during phase 2, after February 28th, 2020 through August 15th. And those two phases are divided in half in terms of your grant disbursement. And when you're asking for funds to be dispersed, it should be appropriate to whatever phase of the project that you are in at that point. Okay, next slide. Okay, for part 4, again, we're going to be asking the following information in a detailed synopsis, and this is located in RFA Section 2. We want you to, in detail, tell us about the means and process to identify the targeted students, We would like you to, in detail, tell us the number of students as well as the disability categories of the students projected to be identified. Also, the description of school-based career development program. We would like a description of the current career development programming efforts for transition from school integrated community-based community-based competitive employment for students with disabilities. We'd also like you to identify gaps in programming and how the grant proposal will affect these gap areas. We'd like you to list all agency and community partners that are involved in the current programming and efforts, as well as include a letter of interagency and community partner support. Again, I mentioned that earlier. Just make sure that you have a specific letter regarding the grant from whatever community agencies that you're going to be partnering with. We'd also like you to describe your plan to engage the following stakeholders in the planning and implementation of the grant project. How are you going to engage family and caregivers? How are you going to engage LEA personnel, as well as local businesses? So those three main stakeholders we'd like you to address: family caregivers, LEA personnel, and local businesses. How will they be engaged in your grant project? We'd also like you to describe the structure and anticipated artifacts included in the career portfolio for those identified students, as well as describe your vision for sustaining or expanding the project at the end of the grant period. One of the things that we've talked about internally here is that we want to caution you in terms of sustainability of the grant. When you're planning that, you can plan for the amount that you have and you've been awarded, if you've been awarded for this year, but how will you, if you don't have a grant next year, maintain the programming that you've developed through the grant process? Okay, part 5 is the program description and additional grant requirements during phase 1 and phase 2. One of the things that will definitely occur is there will be 2 on-site visits for each LEA that is awarded a grant. Again, who does those site visits will be determined after we know the exact amount of grants that we've awarded. It will start out being those folks who are involved in the transition initiative with Patton. But if we have a number that's not manageable, we will also rely on our IU tax staff to assist us with that. Okay. Next part is the budget. Again, you are able to apply for up to $30,000 per site. The funding available to each successful grant application through the date of the award of August 2020 will be, again, determined on what you request and what the scoring feels would be eligible for grant funding. Just keep in mind that during phase 1, the request for reimbursements must align explicitly only with phase 1 activities, as well as during phase 2. If you're requesting funds during phase 2, they must align with whatever activities that you have planned for phase 2. Also, please keep in mind that equipment costs, clothing, except for work uniforms, not streetwear. Gift cards, food and entertainment, and student salaries are not allowable expenses. I'm going to repeat that for everybody. Equipment costs, clothing, except for work uniforms. Gift cards, food and entertainment, and student salaries are not allowable expenses through the grant. Keep in mind, if you have put in your grant that you're going to be purchasing general supplies, that is an allowable expense. It must be done prior to May 31st, 2020. Okay, the next section, again, is still budgets, part 6. Budget categories, again, you're going to be submitting a line item budget through the application process for that will include a narrative explaining the projected expenditures for each of those categories. Some of the allowable expenditures that you list are staff salaries, excuse me, staff salaries, substitute salaries, materials and supplies, professional development, and related travel. Again, those things I mentioned earlier that are not allowed would not be able to be listed under allowable expenses. Again, that deadline of May 31st for the general supplies to be ordered. Okay, just a note that during phase 1, requests for reimbursements must align, again, I mentioned that earlier, must align with phase 1 activities. Phase 2 requests must go with phase 2.
Boyd.
I'm going to ask if you could check. We have a few folks that are not muted. Please make sure that your microphones are muted because we can hear feedback. Okay, we're going to go to part 7 now, the assurance statements. Please keep in mind that the district superintendent, or if you're in an IU, the IU executive director, the charter APS executive director is required to check each statement and sign below, providing assurances of conformance with the specific provisions that are listed within the grant. Those 4 areas that must be checked off and signed off on by the person in charge would be assurance that all activities and expenditures of funds conducted in the association with a program are in direct compliance with the provisions of funding authorities. Secondly, assurance that the reporting requirement outlined in the application package will be submitted in a timely manner. Third, assurance that the program staff will participate in all required PDE and patent training and technical assistance activities. And fourth, finally, assurance that collaboration with appropriate partners to strengthen and extend the impact will be a priority of the project. Again, all of those need to be checked on the application as well as signed off with a title and date by your superintendent or executive director or whoever is in charge at your entity. Please keep in mind that the applications must be received by 3 p.m. on Friday, August 30th, 2019. So from today, that gives you about a month to pull everything together. I know that there are many of you that have contacted me as well as Paula Schmidt that are probably already actively working on that, but you do have about a month to pull all of your things together in terms of what we need and get those to us. Please keep in mind that we would prefer electronic submissions. Within the RFA and the grant applications, you will see that submission website, or I'm sorry, email address. It's grants@pattonpittsburgh.net. I'll spell that out. Grants, G-R-A-N-T-S, at pattanpgh.net. We would prefer electronic submissions. However, if you're unable to do that, we certainly will take hard copy submissions. If you're going to send a hard copy submission, make sure that you have a checklist of everything that you need, along with all of your materials. You can send those in snail mail, U.S. mail, to Paula Schmidt, who is our director here at Patton Pittsburgh. I'm going to give you the address if you need it. It's Patton Pittsburgh, 3190 William Pitt Way, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 15238. Again, those are for hard copy submissions, but please keep in mind that we prefer to have electronic. Okay, this next slide I should have gone to, but again, we're going to put, we have all of the information, and folks, I had quite a few emails in terms of who or where you can find the RFA and the application. If you go to the secondary transition page on the Patton website, you need to make sure when you get there that you're scrolling down. It's about halfway down, you'll see the RFA as well as the application. As of hopefully Friday, we will have this webinar there as well, a link to the webinar. So if you talk to folks who need that, please refer them to that page. But I think some folks weren't scrolling down and they weren't seeing it. So just be sure that you're scrolling down and all 3 of those links are there for you. Okay, at this time, we're going to take some questions from the chat box. Again, I'm working and thanking my colleagues, Carol and Hillary. They've been going through these as we've made our way through. First question. Our district is very small. We may not meet no less than 20% because we may this year not have more than 20% of students who have the goal of competitive employment immediately following high school. is there any special consideration for smaller districts? Okay, my answer to that would be not to let the size of the LEA or building determine whether or not you apply. Just be sure that you provide a rationale for why you have selected the number of students that you have for the grant, and those that support the application will carefully consider the rationale that you provide along with the number of students that you select for the grant opportunity. So again, I want to reiterate, folks, we want to take a look at every grant application that has a meaningful goal, that has meaningful goals, and please don't let that deter you from applying, and we'll make sure that everybody on our side is aware of the situation in terms of your numbers. The next question that we had, our contacts at OVR suggested applying for this grant to start a t-shirt printing program for our students. We would need funding to purchase the t-shirt printing press and t-shirt supplies. Are those allowable expenses? I noticed that equipment was listed in the RFA as not allowed. So folks, the answer to that is just what you need to do is keep in mind that equipment is defined as items above $5,000. So as long as the materials you're ordering are under $5,000, it would not be considered equipment. That would be appropriate. You need to keep in mind that anything above $5,000 is designated as equipment, and that would not be allowable. The next question, if we request the max of $30,000, will decisions be made to have partial amounts be awarded? The answer to that is, you know, when you complete the application, you want to carefully consider how you will be using the available funds, and also provide a rationale and a narrative. Your budget will be reviewed by the scoring of the grants, and decisions about partial awards will be determined by the grant team. And again, I've had some questions about scoring. You know, we have 3 patent offices here in here in the state. We have one in Pittsburgh, we have one in Harrisburg, and one in King of Prussia. Depending on where you are applying from, your particular grant applications will be scored by folks that are not in your area. We divvy them up to other folks so that we are pretty sure that there'll be no favoritism shown in terms of grants, and so people who don't know you will be scoring you. So just keep that in mind, and each of the team members then come together at the end and we make a decision in terms of what those awards will look like. The next question, are there character limits on the response sections fields in the grant? The answer to that is no. We want you to be as descriptive as possible in your responses so that the person scoring your application is going to have a full understanding of what your intentions are in terms of the grant. Do you have any more, Carol?
Yeah.
Okay, we're good. She's getting me some more. Again, there's another one that's asking to please review allowable expenses again. Let me go back to that slide. Okay, the budget. Okay, in terms of your line item budget items, you can have salaries professional, salaries clerical, professional contracted services, other professional services, technical services, other purchase professional services, communications, printing and copying, travel and expense for staff, conferences for staff, general supplies, and again, general supplies cannot exceed 20% of your overall program budget. And also any books or periodicals. Okay, so those are your categories that you can use. Okay, I'm going to get back to the questions. Can we purchase career readiness curriculum with grant money? That's a great question, and the answer to that is absolutely yes. Any curriculums that are directly correlated with what you're asking for in your grant is an allowable expense. Next question, can grant money be used to help provide transportation for students? Again, absolutely. That is an allowable expense if you want to use some of that money to fund transportation for students to and from their sites. Next question, will there be an outline or checklist available that will allow us to ensure we have added all your requirements? Again, that's the purpose of the RFA, so please make sure that as you're completing the application, you're referring to the request for applications. That guides you through the writing of the whole grant, and if you've hit everything on the RFA, you will certainly be submitting everything for determination in terms of your eligibility for the grant. Next question, will there be a portal to upload letters of support to the grant proposal? The answer to that would be no. Again, please just make sure you are combining the files as one PDF. If you're sending it electronically, you can scan all of those documents in one and send it as one package to us. That's what we prefer. Okay. Next question. Order a few laptops under the $5,000. Will this be acceptable? The answer to that, again, as defined, we look at the definition of equipment. As long as you stay under the $5,000 threshold, that would not be listed as a. Hopefully everybody's clear on that at this point. Okay. I'm waiting for more questions. I think we have a couple more. Okay. Can grant money pay for job coaches? The answer to that is yes. Yes, but again, as I said earlier in the webinar, make sure that you're thinking about the sustainability of your project when you're thinking about personnel. You want to, you don't want to put something into play that's going to be really beneficial for kids while you have money, and then it has to go away when you don't have grant money or if you don't have grant money. So please just keep that in mind. Also, are indirect costs allowable? The answer to that is yes. For planning purposes, is there an anticipated award date? Yes, we are targeting late September or early October for those. One final question, can you also include on the website a list of allowable expenses? Yes, we can certainly do that. Again, I don't know how, I can't remember how in detail it goes in the RFA in terms of allowable expenses, but we can certainly look about that for you. Okay. Okay, one more question. For those of us relatively new to this process, can you give a few examples of how this funding would ideally be used? What would an ideal program look like in your eyes? Again, that's a difficult question because, number one, we get so many different applications. However, again, I would refer you back to those things that are listed in the RFA because if you're adhering to the RFA and you're giving us everything that we're asking for, chances are we're going to look at that as a viable program. Okay, hopefully we've been able to answer your questions today. I want to thank everybody. We have had there's actually 107 participants today. That's an excellent turnout. We're really happy about that. We're hoping to give out as many of these grants as possible. So please keep in mind my contact here on the screen at this point. Please make sure if you have any questions, you can email me. Or call. That my phone number is listed there. I'm happy to report that we finally have phone service restored back here in the Pittsburgh office. We did not have it for quite a long time, but as of Monday of this week, we do have phones. So if you need to contact me, my number is 412-826-6839. Thanks, everybody, and we hope to hear from you. We look forward to getting your applications. Have a great day.